Okay, good afternoon, folks. I see we're slowly trickling on in, so I will take up some airtime with my voice to allow folks to join us here today. For those who don't know me, I'm Alexis Alvarez. I am the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. And we are here today to discuss the very important topic of the fines and fees that impact your legal aid clients, the true cost of fines and fees. This is a conversation that I'm very passionate about as a former public defender and watching people be assessed, enormous amounts of fees and really drowning in the collateral impacts of that. So I'm very, very honored to be able to bring this conversation to the table here today. So some housekeeping announcements as always. This presentation was accredited CLE credit, 1.0 general CLE credit, and I will announce that credit code at the end. I will also pop it into the chat. Additionally, this is being recorded. A copy of the recording, along with the PowerPoint that our speaker has graciously agreed to share with us, will be sent to you. That way, if you have to drop off, if you have to go out back to your work and handle something, you will get a copy of this recording, so don't worry. Finally, questions and answers. Please feel free to drop your questions and answers into the chat or the Q&A. I will be sharing the PowerPoint today, so I will not be able to address the chat or any questions that are in it. So we will address those towards the end, or if our speaker finds a pregnant pause that she's able to answer them, she will. So please drop them in the chat, share your thoughts, share your feedback. That stimulating conversation is always one of the best parts of these lunch and learn opportunities. And while I say that, I should check to make sure that chat is enabled. If somebody, I'm going to say, is the chat enabled? If somebody could just let me know, I would appreciate it. I know I've been having some issues with that on some of the trainings. So housekeeping is over. Moving on into the introductions. Today we have with us Sarah Couture, who is the Florida State Director at the Fines and Fees Justice Center. In her role, Sarah educates the public on fines and fees reform issues and works with community organizers, legislators, and justice system stakeholders to advance and advocate for state and local campaigns for fines and fees reforms. She began her career as a case manager for family law self-represented litigants in the 13th Judicial Circuit. She next served as the paralegal to the legal department of the 13th Judicial Circuit. And before joining the Fines and Fees Justice Center, Sarah was the community outreach manager for Feeding Tampa Bay. Sarah holds a master's in judicial administration from Michigan State University, an advanced technical certificate in paralegal studies from Hillsborough Community College, and a Bachelor of Science degree in business administration from Southern Nazarene University. Thank you for letting me know that the chat is working. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah while I pull up the PowerPoint. Sarah, thank you for being here to talk to us about this important subject.
Thank you for having me, Alexis. I greatly appreciate this. This is a passion of mine, and I find that people don't know all of the horribles involved with this topic. So I'm excited to be able to share those today. I'll share quickly a little bit about Fines and Fees Justice Center. So we are a nationwide nonprofit. We're just slightly over 4 years old, so we're pretty young. We focus on fine and fees in the criminal justice system. And I have counterparts in New York, New Mexico, and Nevada. And we also have a national team who assists states who are working on these issues that don't have staff in them. And so we'll get started now on my presentation. So next slide. So what is the difference between a fine and a fee? So fines are the monetary sanctions imposed as punishment for violating the law, either criminal or civil, and fees are the costs, assessments, or surcharges imposed to access services to fund the justice system or other government services. In Florida, they go to over 40 different trust funds, in addition to funding our clerks of court. So you can see some different examples. Fines exist for the parking violations, littering, traffic offenses. And then examples of fees are probation fees. If you have ever been a public defender, individuals have to pay $50 just for the application fee to apply for a public defender. Next slide. So here is a brief history of fines and fees. So Michigan in 1846, they enacted the first correctional fee. And then you can see that fees just start getting really popular in the 1980s. 2008, that's when a ton of fees got added after that, particularly here in Florida. There were an additional, it was around 20 fees that got added around that time frame. And then, of course, in 2015, the Department of Justice released the Ferguson report about Ferguson, Missouri, that really highlighted the fine and fee issues. Our co-founder, Lisa Foster, who actually oversees our work here in Florida, she was one of the co-authors of the Ferguson report. And so that kind of explains how we got to the Fines and Fees Justice Center being, was her work through that. Next slide. So in Florida in 1998, the voters passed an amendment to the Constitution. It's commonly referred to as Revision 7. It did quite a few things, but what it did to court fees was it required that court functions of the clerks of court be funded by court fees. And you can see the actual constitutional language from Article 5, Section 14 that talks about adequate and appropriate filing fees for judicial proceedings and service charges and costs for performing their court-related functions. So the thought behind that was prior to this, they were funded by the counties. So you had the larger counties such as Miami-Dade and Hillsborough, and Orange had sufficient funding, whereas smaller, more rural counties did not. And so that was the thinking behind this amendment that was passed, but the impact was not, it's had some unintended impacts. So, for example, it's an unstable source of revenue for the clerk's offices to function off of. They do not get a budget appropriation in the budget process. The courts do, but the clerks do not. So their budgets are based off of revenue estimates that the Revenue Estimating Conference in Tallahassee projects. They do it, I believe, twice a year. So they did it in July, they'll do it in December again, and then sometimes during session, they might release another estimate. But that's how the clerk's budgets are set, is revenue estimates about what they're going to bring in. So it really creates this perverse, system where we are relying on crimes to occur for the clerk's budgets to be funded. So this was really highlighted during 2020 when civil traffic citations drastically fell during the lockdown. It really exposed this. They had to make staffing cuts and budget cuts. Fees haven't actually increased since 2008. That has not happened. But the clerks have suffered tremendously. And like I said, this funds over 40 different trust funds, not just the clerks. Next slide, please. So where are fees imposed? They are imposed at all levels of interaction with the system. And like it says, with or without conviction. And people, will stop me when I say that. And that really alludes to diversionary programs. So you can participate in a diversion program without being convicted if you can afford it, or if that that diversion program has a grant, for example. But otherwise, you have to be able to afford that. It comes with fees. They're not free. So that's why I say they are fees that can be imposed with or without conviction. And like I said, there's so many different types, which we'll see on the next slide. So payment fees, you get charged for a payment plan. So the clerks have an option of either charging a $25 administrative fee when you sign up for a payment plan, or they can charge $5 per payment for receiving or dispersing funds. So if you have somebody, Orange County has taken that $5 fee, for example. So if you pull up someone's case in Orange County and they have a payment plan and they're paying on it, every time they make a payment, you will see a charge of $5 added to their amount. It will show up in the docket on their website. So that really, how do you get out from under that, right? If you have $5 constantly being added because you are making a payment. Warrant fees, counsel fees, again, you get charged for not only you're a public defender here in Florida, but you also get charged for the cost of prosecution, which depending on the offense, it's no less than $50 for a misdemeanor, and it's no less than $100 for a felony. So, those are not the ceilings, those are the floors. So it can vary case to case. Probation and parole fees, juvenile fees. So we charge juveniles the same fees that we charge adults, despite the purpose of the juvenile delinquency system being rehabilitation. And, the intent is not supposed to be penalization like the adult system. These fees become that. We have worked to try and end the fees for juveniles, and that's fight we're still fighting. Traffic fees, diversion fees, as I spoke of, electronic monitoring, phone call fees, pay to stay fees. So phone call fees, that is at county level. And that is something that whoever's controlling the jail, so whether it be the sheriff or if the particular county has a corrections department, that's who controls those contracts. So currently, Miami-Dade County is working to make their jail phone calls free. They've sent out an RFP. They had to extend their current contract, but they still lowered the price per minute. But that's something they're looking at. Pay to stay fees. So most counties charge a daily subsistence fee. I was just looking at Palm Beach County. They have a $3 per day subsistence fee. Miami-Dade has a $2 per day subsistence fee. They recently got rid of $72 million in those unpaid subsistence fees that was fees that were owed that were 7 years or older. So they recently did that. They are also in the process of trying to eliminate that $2 fee. That is included in their current budget proposal for the next fiscal year, which that hearing for that budget is supposed to be voted on tonight. It starts at 5 o'clock. I will be tuning in. But Miami-Dade is a good example of some local work being done. They were selected as a member of our cities and counties for fine and fee justice that just kicked off this month. And so we are going to be working with them with some national partners to continue the work they're doing to try and assist people that are justice system involved in Miami-Dade. Next slide. So these are some examples of fees in Florida. And like I said, you have the indigent public defender application fee, $50. And in this far right column, it shows you if it's collected, where the fees are distributed. And that if it is collected is the key word. So the collections rate are not great. The goal for the clerks, the goal for criminal felony is 9%. That's their collection goal. They actually want to lower that to 8%. So that tells you how they're not even collecting the 9%. County criminal, it's 40% is their collections goal. The highest place where you see on the criminal side, well, it's not criminal. I take that back. The highest place you see their collections goals is civil traffic. So your basic, speeding tickets, low level traffic citations. And that is 90%. And that's why during 2020, it was exposed the high reliance on those civil traffic fees when those civil traffic citations stopped being written. So, and you can kind of see down below where, it goes to several different places. Court costs, crime prevention goes to the crime prevention trust fund. And then you have $1 going here, $1 going there. And so it just gets split so many places. And it's just not a stable funding source for them. And it, relies on, again, crimes being committed. Next slide. So what happens when governments rely on fines and fees? Next slide. So it's a counterproductive economic policy. As I've already said, it's an inequitable and unreliable funding source for them. Cost of collection can outweigh the revenue generated. So in Florida, we have not been able to accurately calculate how much is actually being spent to collect the fines and fees owed. But we know that in New Mexico, as you can see, that they spent at least 41 cents just to collect a single dollar of fines and fees. And so it's costing them money. And so we don't think that that's any different here in Florida. There's just some components that we haven't been able to track down because I'm sure, as all of you know, data here in Florida is very siloed. And so we just haven't been able to come up with that for Florida, unfortunately. Next slide. So Fines and Fees Justice Center, our national team, released a report earlier this year that showed that they were able to document $27.6 billion that fines and fees are owed across the nation, and the rest is unknown. This was based off a series of public records requests that were done, and a lot were incomplete. And so this was just using what they could verify. So we know it's actually much more than this, but it was all that could be documented. Next slide, please. As I alluded to, fines and fees revenue makes budgets dependent on crime. This is a quote from Stephen Dahl, who's the Nevada Judges Association president, talking about policy subconsciously hopes for more crime. A good year in raising administrative assessment fees is a year when the crime rates go up. A bad year is when the crime rates go down. Success in raising administrative assessment fees depends in large part on our failure to prevent crime. So, and this is not a problem that is unique to Florida. What is unique to Florida is our Constitution, where it has in the Constitution that clerks' court functions should be funded by these, that they are funded by these fees. That is unique to us. That makes my job more challenging, but there are ways around it that we've, been trying to come up with creative solutions for the clerk's budgets, still within the constitutional provisions at this time. But we certainly don't want, crime to be, or budgets to be dependent on crimes occurring. Next slide. So now I want to talk about the impacts on families and communities with this policy. Next slide. So let's look at what happens when you can't afford to pay your fines and fees. So your inability to pay leads to increased fines and fees. If you don't pay in full or you don't set up a payment plan within 30 days, you get a $25 delinquency fee added off the bat. So say you don't do either of those, you get that $25 fee. You still have to drive, whether it be to get your kids to work or get your kids to school or you to work. Public transportation is not great around here at all in Florida. I would say at best, Miami has the best, and it's still not great. When you look at statistics of how long it takes somebody to travel to work in Miami-Dade even. So people will continue to drive. So then if they get a DWLS, the punishment becomes more severe. Additional fines and fees get added on. And it just creates this cycle that almost becomes impossible to get out from under. People get extremely discouraged, end up losing employment, losing their house, occupational license holds. It just affects every part of somebody's life. Next slide. People have to make hard choices, such as, do you feed your family or do you pay your fines and fees? So this information came from our friends at Alabama Appleseed, who did a survey. It's part of a report called Under Pressure. I highly recommend reading that. It's very insightful. But it showed that more than 8 in 10 people with court debt gave up necessities like rent, food, medical bills, car payments, and child support to pay their court debt. Approximately 45% of them lost their license because they were unable to pay their court debt. Alabama still suspends for unpaid court debt like we do. Fun fact, our friends in Mississippi do not. They stopped suspending. It was an initiative of their governor a few years ago. He spearheaded that, and they no longer suspend. Nearly 50% said they have been jailed for failure to pay court debt. The good news is we do not, at least to my knowledge, if you happen to find someone, please let us know. Otherwise, we will get in contact with our friends who do litigation. But in Florida, we do not jail people for failure to pay court debt. Where you see it is the DWLS. If they are getting DWLS after DWLS after DWLS. So they will get put in jail for the DWLS. They won't technically be put in jail for, they're not getting a charge for failure to pay. But if you run across someone, like I said, please reach out because that's not okay, and we will reach out about litigating that. Next slide, please. So law enforcement takes up a lot of their time when it comes to enforcing DWLS. So it actually makes our communities less safe. So every 1% increase in revenue from fines and fees correlates with a 6% decrease in violent crime clearance and an 8.3% decrease in the property crime clearance rate, because they are having to spend their time pulling someone over, running their license, discovering it's suspended. They have to get the car towed. They have to take them to jail. They have to do all the paperwork. So that's, time that they could be spent on these violent crime and property crime, but also, dangerous driving infractions. If you look at the suspension notices that are issued here in Florida, a large majority, as in the notices that are issued, 74.25% in 2021 were for failure to pay, not for dangerous driving. We think that, FFJC thinks that license suspension should be used for dangerous driving and making the roads safer and not criminalizing poverty like they currently are. So again, according to that Alabama Appleseed survey, 38% of people who responded admitted to committing at least one crime to help pay off their debt. And the imposition of juvenile fees is associated with increased likelihood of recidivism. So we are working with a group of researchers here in Florida who are in the process of doing a study with data from DJJ that shows this. So they've run the first set of data, and it came back showing that if they look at different categories, that juveniles who owe fees have the highest rates of recidivism, which doesn't surprise us, but that is forthcoming, hopefully later this winter, if not sooner. Okay, next slide, please. We know that fines and fees disproportionately impact communities of color. People living in poor areas are also more impacted by fines and fees. Racial disparities exist in traffic stops, citations, and arrests. And we know that wealth is extracted from the entire family, especially women. So we put out a report in October of 2019, and as part of that report, we worked with a student who she took zip code level data and overlaid it with census data, and it showed just this. It showed that zip codes that had the highest level of Black people living in them also had the highest level of suspension rate. And the same with when we ran it with poverty, and we ran it with the 200% figure. Same thing. So we know, even if we don't have the racial data when it comes to the driver's license suspensions, because it's just not part of the data that's provided, we know that when we can look at the data for traffic stops and citations and arrests, we can make that correlation that there's a disparity based on that. Next slide, please. So what can we do to end the harms of the fines and fees? So next slide. Fines and fees reforms are a bipartisan effort. So you have an interesting group of people working on this nationwide. So you have the ACLU, the Institute for Justice, Right on Crime, SPLC, us, ALEC, all working on this. And in the near future, as in a couple of weeks, the first week of October, we are launching a national campaign along with ACLU and Americans for Prosperity that is going to be a campaign focused on the elimination of fees nationwide. All, kind of buckets, right? So right now in Florida, we're working on eliminating the juvenile fees. And then you have Miami-Dade looking at those jail fees that they're working on. So there's opportunities state and locally to do this. And so that is going to be forthcoming, but really eliminating those fees that are essentially regressive taxes, if you want to look at it that way, will definitely, get rid of the harm. The fines, it's going to be looking at making those equitable to someone's crime and their situation at the time of sentencing. Done. Everybody is charged, based off of their score sheet. And so it doesn't look at an individual's ability to pay right now. Next slide. So in Florida, the first solution is ending driver's license suspensions related to court debt. And so that is what we have been working on since 2019. We are going to run a bill again this session that ends those suspensions. So Our only, as you can imagine, probably based on what I've already said, our only opponents have been the clerk's offices. So we are also working to, at the same time, come up with realistic solutions for them and their budgets, so that they will stop fighting this bill. Our stance has always been, if you give people their licenses, which then gives them the ability to get to work, they will pay. You don't have, you will always have people who are going to willfully not pay, but there are, mechanisms in place through the courts to enforce that. Most people want to pay, but they don't have the ability, especially when they can't drive to work. So next slide. Why end this? Like I've said, it costs people their livelihoods. They lose their jobs. They normally have to take, a lower paying job if they are able to find a new one. 86% of Americans drive to work, and many jobs require a driver's license, even if you don't actually have to drive for the job. They see it as showing somebody's reliability. Suspending licenses cuts economic growth. So we know that people who can't work or who lose their income due to a suspended license have less money to contribute to the economy and less money to pay their fines and fees, obviously. And economist from Dartmouth, who took the 2019 driver's license suspension data from here in Florida, and he was able to calculate that off of those numbers from 2019, that Florida lost out on $491 million in consumer spending, just based on driver's license suspensions for failure to pay alone. So that shows that it impacts all of us. License suspensions undermine public safety. As I said, law enforcement, they're using their valuable time to stop and cite and fine and arrest people for driving on a suspended license. They have less time to focus on those other crimes that are actually endangering people's lives. And then increased tax base and overall GDP. So there was a study that was done in Phoenix, and it showed that they had an increase overall in their GDP when they gave people their licenses back and affordable payment plans. Next slide. So 22 states have already passed this. So Free to Drive is our national campaign, and they work on slowly ending debt-based driver's license suspensions. So we have 22 states and DC who have passed reforms to curb license suspension since 2017. There are 120 plus organizations all across the political spectrum. We have businesses supporting this. So in Florida, for example, we have the Florida Trucking Association, we have Uber from the business world who are supporting this. And then, as I already said, we have Americans for Prosperity, the ACLU, and Southern Poverty Law Center. So it's not a partisan issue at all. Next slide. Second solution for Florida, eliminating those fees for juveniles and discharging debt. So as you can imagine, we want kids to be in school, right? Getting an education, not worrying about paying off their fines and fees. Next slide. So again, the juvenile fees fall disproportionately on youth of color and their families. So the parents are liable for the debt, and then when the child turns 18 and they become an adult, they become liable for the debt. And so it doesn't start them off in a great position. Their license can be prospectively suspended. So if you have a 14-year-old who gets charged fees, they don't pay it, their license will be suspended at 14, even though they don't have a license, nor can they until they're 16. They will prospectively suspend it. Again, associated with higher recidivism, we have that forthcoming study that's going to show that. The study is actually one that is being replicated out of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. But it's being done on this statewide basis here. Same results, which don't surprise us. It's being done by Dr. Alex Pequero. He was at the University of Miami, but was recently appointed by President Biden to be the director of the Bureau for Justice Statistics, which is why we don't have a date right now when the study is going to be released. So he was working on it with partners, but they've had to pick up a majority of the load, but he was the head researcher. So but I have been told, like I said, they got the preliminary and data analysis back, and so they're working on it, but that will be forthcoming. And like I said, debt may follow children into adulthood. So one of the horrific stories that we were told, our partners at the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia did a listening tour. And one of the groups they spoke to were guardian ad litems. There was a guardian ad litem here in Florida who shared a story about a child that they were representing and how the child was a crossover youth, meaning they were in both the dependency and the delinquency system. They owed money. I'm not sure how much they owed, but it was enough that the prospective adoptive parents said, we can't take on this liability. So this child was going to be stuck in the foster system because of these fees in the delinquency system. Luckily, they got taken care of and this child was adopted. But their point was this should not be happening to any child. Especially one, where it's going to prohibit them from getting out of the foster system. So we've just said, kids shouldn't be charged these fees at all. And next slide. Why should we eliminate them? They operate as a regressive tax. There's no relationship to accountability. So one of the things that I hear all the time, whether it be adults or whether it be juveniles, is accountability and responsibility. So in terms of the juvenile fees, there's no relationship to accountability. These are fees being charged for them because they're in the system. So judges can still order community service. They can still order restitution. They can still order a whole litany of things that they have in their toolbox. Writing a book report, I've seen that done before. Writing an apology letter, seen that done before in a Walker plan. So they can still do all these things to hold the kids, quote unquote, accountable for their actions. And so there's no relationship to that accountability. And it was very interesting recently. There was a legislator who talked about how his position was that if parents can afford to pay, they should pay. And so I in turn said, well, how does that hold a child responsible or accountable if the parents are paying? It doesn't teach them accountability or responsibility if their parents are paying. And he just kind of looked at me like, oh, you're right. And so there's just no relationship there. It's counterproductive to economic policy and again, decrease those public safety mechanisms. Next slide. Again, with the juveniles, we have both red and blue states that are driving this reform. Utah, New Mexico, Louisiana, Texas, New Jersey, Maryland, Oregon. In the state of Washington this year, their equivalent of DCF actually brought forth a bill to end their cost of care fees. So cost of care here in Florida, it's $5 per day for kids who are in custody, and it's $1 per day for kids who might be under any type of other supervision, but they're not in custody. That adds up. And so their equivalent of DCF came forward and said, hey, we want to get rid of these fees. And they did that. We have requested from DJJ their collections, and they're low, as you can imagine, because again, these are kids. And so we are in the process of setting up a meeting with them to discuss that, in hopes that maybe that might be something they're interested in, like Washington did, where we already have the bill, so they would just have to support us. But really looking at that and saying to them, like, you know, here's the study showing that kids who owe these fees are, you know, have the highest rates of recidivism. Here's your collections rate. Like, it's probably costing the state, right? Like, if you go back to the cost of collections in New Mexico, like, how much is it costing the state to keep these kids in custody and have them stuck in the system with these fees? Probably quite a bit. So we're working to figure out that. It's not all doom and gloom though. Next slide. We have made some baby steps in Florida. Next slide. So in 2021, the legislature passed, and this was through the clerks of court, their bill, the creation of a uniform payment plan. The first thing I did when I first started working at Fines and Fees Justice Center in 2019 was I did a public records request to all 67 clerks. I quickly discovered that there were 67 different payment plans running around, not only in form, but also in provisions. And so in the session of 2020, in our driver's license suspension bill, we also put provisions to make uniform payment plans and make them affordable. We found out that leadership liked that. So did the clerks. So the clerks started putting some of the provisions in their priority bill. So their priority bills generally have to do with their funding, like shoring up their funding, whether it be getting like reimbursements for domestic violence, case filings, things of that nature. So things that don't concern our work or haven't yet, I will say that. And so we've supported their bills because they're kind of using them as a like, give us this is what we're doing kind of thing. And which, if you can get it passed, fine by me. So uniform payment plans passed. And the thought of that was, if you think about the civil side, there's just all kinds of Supreme Court approved forms that are used throughout the state, especially when it comes to family law. And so having that background in the Florida state courts, I was like, we need a uniform payment plan so that you can go to one county and get the same payment plan. In theory, you may owe different, so that's going to, you know, change the amount. But the thought is you should have the same provisions afforded to you. So they passed that uniform payment plan just for the form in 2021. Then this year, they passed the affordability piece. And so that went into law July 1st. And what happens is a monthly payment now is determined. It's either $25 or it's 2% of somebody's annual net income divided by 12. It's whichever of those two amounts is greater. We also found that some clerks require down payments. Most of them don't, but the ones who do, they were absurd, as in $1,500 for a down payment to get a payment plan. Seminole County, they required 25% of what you owed down to get a payment plan. So now if a clerk requires a down payment, it cannot be, it's either $100 or 10% of what somebody owes. And in this case, it's whichever of those two amounts is lesser. So there's a cap of $100 on that basically, which is a harm reduction. We'd rather have no down payment, but that's definitely a harm reduction from what was out there. So people can now receive affordable payment plans. We have tried to publicize this because we constantly get contact forms on our website. Florida gets the most by far. And a lot of them consist of, you know, I want to pay, but I can only pay $50 a month, and they want $150, and they won't let me get a payment plan. And if you think about it, if you take the morality of that out of it, just from a business perspective, like the clerk's budgets rely on these fines and fees being paid. And they are telling people, and this isn't true for all of them. We do know some that are phenomenal at working with people before these provisions were passed, but you're telling me you'd rather have no dollars than $50 because you want $150. They can't afford that. They're telling you they can afford 50, but you're saying no. And so we believe that their revenues are actually going to increase because they've made these payment plans affordable now. They will only increase more if we can give people their licenses back. We have evidence of that out of California, where the full year after they did these two things, their collections increased 8.9%. So we believe that would happen here too. Next slide. So how can you help? Next slide. So if you have the capability to provide legal assistance, so we do not provide any type of individual assistance. So one of the things we do provide is we have a list of legal aid providers that when people contact us, they get this list and they can choose you know, who to contact. And so if you or your organization has the capacity to be put on that list and wants to, that would be great because we know the limits of legal aid. We recognize that. And so it's, you know, there's not a lot of people out there to help. You have people who will, you know, want to go to court and ask about, you know, filing motions, right? And it's not an easy system to navigate when you're a pro se litigant. Certainly on the criminal side, you know, it's not on the civil side either. It's a little easier because of those Supreme Court packets that they have for different things, but certainly on the criminal side, people reach out to us and they are extremely frustrated and don't know what to do. So they just give up. Talking to your legislators in your personal capacity, you can reach out to your elected legislators and encourage them to support our legislation. And then also sharing stories with us. If you have a client who has experienced issues with fines and fees and they're willing to share their story publicly, that would be great to connect them to us. That is another way that you can help. Next slide. Where can you learn more about fines and fees policy? Next slide. So we have a clearinghouse on our website, and it is a digital library with over 400 articles, summaries of research, litigation, policy guidance, media, and so much more. One of the things that our co-directors wanted when they created FFJC was this clearinghouse to be a one-stop shop for information about fines and fees. And so it's set up like Google. I use it all the time, actually, when I need to find an example. I just go in there and I'll put in a term and you can sort it by location. There's all different ways you can sort it, but it's a great resource. And I highly recommend digging through there. Next slide. Questions, and I see we have one in the Q&A. So it's from Deborah, and she asked, are people who apply and are awarded indigency status with the clerk elude or given a fraction of the fees and fines imposed? Nope, they are given the full amount of everything at this time. So we have some provisions in proposed legislation that it proposes if somebody who is found indigent makes a certain number of payments on time, that their balance would be forgiven after a certain amount of time. I don't know the reality of that, but that is something we are trying to do, because again, there's not an ability to pay that is done at sentencing. Now you can, in the case of felonies, SB 7066, which was the implementing bill for Amendment 4, they did give judges the discretion, if somebody comes back in front of them, to waive or reduce those fines or fees or convert them to community service. So another thing we've done in the draft language that we have for the driver's license bill, we've also given judges discretion for misdemeanor and traffic as well, because it's just not in statute. We know some do it, which is great, but they don't necessarily have that power in statute. So we have that written in there as well, beyond where they are granted that for the felonies when it comes to voting rights. I don't know if anybody else has any more questions. I don't see any in the Q&A. Oh, you're on mute.
I said, sorry, I was unsharing my screen and then you went away. And I think, that's a really great point that you bring up at the end there with, giving judges discretion within the legislation. I know when I was practicing, there were many, many judges that really did want to waive fees. They really did. And there were clients that I had that they were never, they were homeless. They were not going to be able to pay the fees, period. And judges really, the one thing stopping them was their lack of discretion.
Right.
So that's really
everything's mandatory. I forgot to talk about that. So all these fees are mandatory.
Yeah.
So they don't even have discretion, and the amounts are mandatory too. Where you see the discretion with the amounts in the fees is those cost of prosecution and cost of counsel fees. There's some discretion there. But otherwise, the discretion sits in the fines. The fine statute, depending on the level of crime, they have discretion on that. It gives ceilings there in statute based on the level of the offense. And so that's really the only discretion they have. So having worked for the judges, they would like the discretion based on comments I have heard from them in the past. But we would also like them to have the discretion too. So that's one of the provisions that we've put in our draft legislation this year to address when it comes to the driver's license suspension. So it ends driver's license suspensions, but then it also does some other things to help people out, giving the judges discretion. It also imposes, it adds the word single to Florida Statute 322.29, which that has to do with a reinstatement fee. That's separate and apart from the clerks. That gets paid to the DMV. So what we found happens is people pay off the clerk and then they go to the DMV, or the clerk can reinstate a license, or the tax collector can reinstate a license. And depending on who's doing that reinstatement, literally between those three, but also geographically where it's happening, we discovered that sometimes people get charged one $60 reinstatement fee for their license, and other times they're getting charged $60 per suspension on their license. So you can, if you have 2 suspensions, that's $120.
Wow.
So we added the word single in the draft, because in all other reinstatement situations in statute, it specifies that it's one. So we want to do that in this situation as well, just because it seems like it's the Wild West and chaos, and it, depending on where you are, who's doing the reinstatement and where, that it varies, and it shouldn't. And so, because they don't have a payment plan situation like the clerks do. And so that's one of the things we get contacted about as well. Is there anything I can do? And in that situation, we can't even, that's where you all can't even help out, because that is a situation where it is what it is. Like, it's in statute. Courts can't do anything about that. It's a DMV fee. And so we're trying to do what we can with that to help that situation out, because there's just not any options for those individuals. And so their license stays suspended.
Awesome. That's amazing, amazing work that you do as someone who is on the front lines dealing with it. I know it's as clear as mud for folks when they're trying to go and get back on track. And I have personal experience with the multiple reinstatement fees, not my cases, but I've had clients that, came back and they were like, they're telling me I need this. And I'm like, why? So, getting it at the top, at the legislature, is the way to go about it, right? That's how you make that systemic change. So, I hope that folks who are on here today see the ways in which, we can support folks who are suffering through the fines and fees ringer that exists in this state and throughout, our country. I hope that you all have, know you have the resources now to contact the Fines and Fees Justice Center. I know when I was also doing some other types of litigation and at Florida Legal Services before I moved into my director position, I reached out and they were very, very helpful, giving me some clarity and some options, which sometimes in the legal aid world is just the most amazing thing to have when you're talking to a client. So with that said, I will pop the CLE code into the chat. I apologize. It is 2207249, N as in Nancy. And this presentation was accredited for 1 general CLE credit. You will receive a copy of this recording along with the PowerPoint and that CLE code in an email within 24 hours. That email will come from Zoom, not from me directly. And while I let Sarah provide any closing remarks, I'll put my email into the chat just in case anybody doesn't get that email from Zoom and wants to reach out to me directly.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And you will have the last slide in the presentation has my contact information. It has our website. It has FFJC's Twitter handle. It has mine. I will give the announcement that if you follow me on Twitter, you get a combination of social justice reform and then a lot of it's a balance between Tampa Bay sports. So I'm a huge Tampa Bay Lightning fan. So I'm just going to preface that for you. But as session gets going, it'll switch more to what we're working on. But definitely follow me on Twitter for more information about what we're doing.
And I can't wait to see all of the exciting things, that the Fines and Fees Justice Center is doing. I'm very humbled by the work that you do, and I love your organization. And I am looking forward to seeing everything that, comes out in the future. And
Thanks.
I just received a message I need to copy. And all right. And with that, everybody enjoy your lunch. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us here today. I can't promise I won't bother you again for another collaboration if you'll have me.
Absolutely.
And with that, everybody have a fantastic day.